Good evening, welcome. My name is Laura Heisler, and I am Director of Programming for the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation and Director of Outreach for the Mortgage Institute for Research. And on behalf of those two organizations, as well as the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery, we comprise the entities that work in this building, and we are delighted to welcome you to what I believe is the 5th year of the Crossroads of Ideas series. This series takes place on a Tuesday evening once each month during the academic year, and our goal with this series is to engage you in a conversation about topics that matter to all of us. Think more front page, not just science page, that also happen to be the subject of groundbreaking research here at UW-Madison. So what I want to do now is say a little bit about what's coming for the rest of this semester. If you got an email about tonight's event, you'll hear about all of those. I also want to mention that if that's not enough for you once a month, we do host the Wisconsin Science Festival in this building, in this room, as well as all across Wisconsin. And I want to encourage you to go to wisconsinsciencefest.org to find more than 250 different thought-provoking events that connect science and society and our times. But in terms of what's coming for this semester, next month, we have a compelling conversation about how we begin our process of adapting as individuals and societies to climate change with Professor Noah Feinstein from the School of Education here at UW-Madison. In November, oops, I had another slide. In November, I do know what we're doing. On November 19th, I believe, we have a conversation about the transportation future for Wisconsin with people from the Nelson Institute Engineering here on campus, as well as the city and the state Smart Cities Initiative. And in December, on December 10th, we have a conversation about personalized treatments for cancer with Melissa Scala and Dustin Deming from UW-Madison School of Medicine. So again, if you got an email for today, you'll get an email about those. If you didn't and you would like to, please just add your name to the list that was outside the door when you came in. One more housekeeping note. So we're going to run this conversation, hear from our two speakers until about 1:15, and then we're going to move to a Q&A. We do record all of these sessions, and you'll be able to find the recordings on discovery.wisc.edu in about a week or so. But because we record them, we ask that you wait for one of our two mic runners, a fleet young undergraduates, to reach you with a microphone, and that way we capture your question and also everyone else can hear you. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce you to Professor Jo Handelsman, who's the director of the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery, one of the two research organizations in this building, to say a little bit about her organization and tonight's speakers.
Well, thank you, Laura, for organizing this great event, which I'm a great fan of, and for the introduction. It really is going to be an exciting year for those of you who follow all the Discovery events, and particularly the Science Festival. I think it's the most exciting science festival yet, and so I encourage everybody to be involved. And there, as you heard, are many other events this semester and next. So as Laura said, I run the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery, which is the institute at the west end of the building. On the upper floors, and our research is very broad. We bring together data sciences and biology and engineering in ways that intersect in, I think, really remarkable areas of endeavor. And one of the areas that we're particularly strong in is within the data sciences, is the field of optimization, which perhaps we'll hear a little bit about tonight. When I first came here as director, I didn't know what that word meant, except the way we use it in colloquial English. So I was fascinated to find out that it pertains to all sorts of biological phenomena, industrial phenomena, optimizing systems, and as well as economics. And so we're going to hear from one of our truly fantastic faculty, Professor Tom Rutherford, tonight, who is an optimization and data science specialist. He's in the Department of Applied and Agricultural Economics, as well as industrial and systems engineering, which gives you a little bit of a sense of the breadth of his intellect and interests. I can never keep up with what he's doing, from climate change to Brexit. He really has fascinating interests in optimization and data science. His research is broad and changing all the time. He's been involved not only in a lot of British policy making on Brexit, but energy markets and international trade of various kinds, technical change, and computational economics. His methods are very mathematical. I'm told he's one of the best mathematicians on campus. And he has used that power of math for the benefit of policy. And having had a background in both science and policy myself, I really appreciate that there are scientists and data scientists around willing to use their great intellects and mathematical tools for the benefit of policymakers. He's been not only here at the University of Wisconsin, but on the faculty of the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, as well as the University of Colorado at Boulder and the University of Western Ontario. He's joined tonight by his collaborator, Praveen Dixit, who is from the U.S. Department of Commerce. He's Deputy Assistant Secretary for Trade Policy and Analysis and brings a really important perspective to our discussions of trade tonight. He's responsible there at the Department of Commerce for economic analysis, data collection, and dissemination. And he's interested in particularly trade policy that will affect the activities in the U.S. that will increase exports and manufactured products as well as services. So he has a background both in commerce but also in the Department of Agriculture, and he has a PhD from Purdue University and is, as you can tell, an expert in many international trade issues, including in Asia and Latin America. So I think we're in for a real treat tonight from these two experts, and I will turn it over to them to tell us about trade.
Thanks, Joe. Is that too loud? I don't know if the volume is right. It's great to be here, really fun. Maybe I can get by without, is that too loud? Okay, well, I'm very pleased to be here. It's fun. I'm the token economist in the building. And so when I was asked to put together a talk about something I'm doing, I was thinking, all this crazy trade stuff is fun. And then lo and behold, the next week, Praveen shows up with his team from Commerce to meet with us about the project we're working on. And I say to him, Praveen, I'd like to come back and tell us about what it's like to analyze trade negotiation deals under Trump, right? He says, great, I'd love to. So here he is. Boy, so I'm really looking forward to having a chance to hear from him. We're doing this tag team. So my assignment is to introduce you to what is an economic model, how do we analyze trade, and then I'll regale you with some stories about analyzing Brexit. So a little bit about that, just to give you a feeling for how this stuff works. Part of it is to sort of explain how do academics fit into this. For people who are not in the know, this all seems kind of mysterious. How does this actually happen? So my game plan is to try to give a bit of an introduction to what a model is. And to do that, I'm going to be a little bit gratuitous. I apologize. I'm going to rely on my biographical references for explaining this. I'm going to talk about the market for mules and porters in Lumjung district in Nepal. So this was the model that made me decide to do economics. So I'll tell you a little bit about that as well. So this is basically, I need to refer to, I think Pascal 1650 was the first person who said, I apologize because I didn't take the time to write a short letter. So I apologize for not taking the time. I could have distilled this talk for another 2 days without having it. So I'll talk about what is economics and what are general equilibrium models. So economics, I love this quote from Keynes. The idea of economics is to think about a method rather than a doctrine, apparatus in the mind. So we're trying to think about ways to think about problems. And it's important to distinguish, if you're in a scientific environment, about the search for truth versus the establishment of a framework for thinking about things. And that's really what the main message I want to get is that models in economics are the main tools we use. And the purpose of model is to provide a framework for thinking about a problem. models can be used in different ways. My department now in Ag Econ, most people are positive. They want to know how the world works. They're measuring elasticities. They're doing regressions. My framework is more about policy. So I'm interested in, how do we think about what is a good outcome and how do we model the system and how the system responds. So the main point here is to think about models that are used to think about the consequences of policy. I work with a class of models called applied general equilibrium models. They're unapologetically old school. They're sort of theory of demand, theory of producers, based on some sort of, you can bring in engineering sorts of ideas, but it's fundamentally based on the neoclassical paradigm. You can do things where you bring in agents and you bring in non-optimizing behavior and behavioral aspects, but for the most part, this is old school. And so the theory is kind of dated, but still is the dominant tool that's used for analyzing most trade agreements. So we can disagree about philosophically where we'd like to go, but this is really this is the game and its main game in town. In defense of this approach, it's versatile, so it takes into account lots of factors. If there's something you think risk is an important dimension, you can bring that in. Technology expectations. It can be calibrated or estimated, so this is what's known in econometrics as a structural approach. So you have a model that you can estimate the behavior. And so it has lots of ways that it can work, but it also can be conformed to what's known as Occam's razor. So a theory should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. And the final thing is modesty is warranted. And this is where I'd say a lot of policymakers and modelers go off the rails, right? It's important to recognize that we don't learn everything from a model. And in the policy domain I work in, I view the model results as a necessary but not a sufficient condition. In other words, if you're going to say we should cut taxes by 50% because government revenue is going to go up by 300%, show me a model where that happens. Show me a set of elasticities. Show me I don't care about the truth. Just show me one framework where you get that to come out, so I can assess whether or not that makes sense. You go to analyze Brexit, you say, show me one framework where this is going to cause an 8% increase in UK GDP. And then if you're a modeler, you can look through the thing and say, aha, they assume that any export from the EU faces a 50% non-tariff barrier, and if they leave, they'll lose that tariff barrier. So basically their export price will double. That was the assumption that gave rise to Brexit. That was the number. And the thing is that it may be that, whether it's precisely the right model or not, it's like the dialogue should be conducted in the framework which has evidence. And that's the basic role of these models, is let's bring some evidence together and see what happens. If we approach it that way, it means that oftentimes we may not know the answer. We don't know exactly what the outcome is. And for lots of big shocks, for these like crazy stuff that's happening now in trade, it's very hard to predict what's going to happen 6 months from now. There's all sorts of factors. The role of expectations, people placing bets on this or that. So modesty is warranted, but there still is a role for models, even if they're based on old school ideas. The problem with models is I was very pleased to learn last week, the far side is coming back. So this is just to get you all warmed up. The far side is coming back, right? So this is Hell's Library. I would show this to my graduate students who are taking the modeling class. The Hell's Library is full of books. Story problems galore, more story problems. This is the whole thing. It's like 5th grade math, Sarah works at the 5 and 10. The thing costs $1.39. The person gives her $2. How much money does she give back in change? It's all about take the story and write the model. Take the story, write the model. Make sense of the model, go back, ask yourself, where are you inadequate, and go back and revise. So it's all about going from words to equations. So now I'm going to go into this gratuitous diversion to talk about me. So I apologize, but as I said, I didn't have time to write a short letter, so this is the letter I had sitting there. So 1977, I'm graduating from college in engineering. There's this chance to do this job that reads like Mission Impossible. I get rejected for the job. I send the job description to my brother. He's graduating in structural engineering from Cornell. He gets accepted immediately. They can't fill the program. They come back and tell me, do you want to go after all? So my brother and I were the first brothers in the Peace Corps, and we were both in the Himalayas building suspension bridges. So this was my first job for 2 years. Man, it was a great job. It was really fun. It's like, it was up and down the trail, building two trails to complete the Dumre-Manong. There I am with my bridge crew. That's about half of them, but It's basically Harkle, the guy right next to me, had been in the British Gurkhas, and so he was an amazing guy. And so we had a really good team. It was really fun. And in the process of doing that, I had to send lots of porters up and down the trail. So I'd send things off from the railhead and go up and retrieve them. And this was the way we got the materials. It was the first bridge I worked on was 125 kilometers from the road. And I had to do the round trip 15 times the first year. It was like a lot of hiking. But I got to know all the porters. And we worked on the bridge. That was fun. There's the bridge with Douglas Heck, the American ambassador. At the opening, he came with a helicopter. The helicopter hadn't landed in Lumjung forever. And so we had like 700 people there. The bridge went right to full load right off the bat. And Heck was happy to be at the front and cut the ribbon and walk across as long as I was right next to him. So that was fun. So I came back and went to graduate school thinking I was going to learn how to organize bridge projects. I immediately realized that bridge design is important, but how to getting all the stuff to the bridge site was what really mattered. So I thought I was going to do that. And so I went to industrial engineering, sort of operations research at Stanford. And there I met Alan Mann, and Alan Mann had other plans for me. So he said, no, you should be working on economics. I said, no, economics, that's a little bit too. Engineers are always afraid to get into economics because economics is always won by the person who's better at rhetoric is always going to win. It's not the model doesn't win. It's always the person who has a better argument. So there's this tendency not to want to move in that direction. But then I got interested in this, and Charling Koopman's Nobel address from '75 had a big influence on me. It was like economic theory and optimization. Very exciting during that period. Very much like today in the sense there was the emergence of new computational methods and a large class of problems we can work on. I mean, you see this in the young guys now in data sciences here. There's the world has tons of fascinating things to work on now. It's a fantastic time to be in this game. Expectations were high. There was this idea that if we could develop better models to understand the world, we could make better decisions. So I wrote a thesis, got a piece of software running, and I was always a little bit, I just decided, when I knew I had my thesis just about written up, I decided it was time to take a break. And I decided, well, it's time to go back to Nepal. Let's go back and see what's going on. So I took a break for 3 months. And my brother was working in Kathmandu, so I went to visit him, and then I went back to Nepal. And then I went out to where the bridges were built, and wow, the price of rice and manong had fallen by 70%. There were like 300 mules on the trail going up and down. Apart from the mules working for trekking agencies, there were no porters in the trail. All the guys I knew were gone, right? There was none of them doing this stuff. Man, this is really weird. What's going on here? How did this happen, right? And of course, that was all because the mules were running up and down the trail because the bridges were built, and so that you didn't have to have porters. So I found that really kind of interesting, and at the time, I was working on algorithms for solving problems, but I decided on that trip I should try to build a model and understand what's going on. So I built a model. I won't bore you with data, but you can talk about where the villages are and how many people there are and what they have, and you try to calibrate the thing to understand what's going on. And I analyze it, and so then I come up with some points, data points. Man, this is kind of wild. Here we have the provision of portering services by village. So there's one village that's very poor. 25% of the people are portering. Here we have people, 5% are portering, so there's this range. And then we track what's the impact on their well-being. And these guys in the middle, not much of an effect. These guys who are working primarily as porters, they lose a lot. And then the people who weren't portering very much, they gain a ton, right? So this was one of the things, the first time that struck me, wow, that's kind of interesting to see. I wonder if we could have predicted that beforehand. How would we analyze? And on that trip, I was fascinated by how this works. And so the basic message is, and the thing is about this message, this is not a different message from the message you get today. Think about trade agreements and so forth. You have a technological change. It could be that you permit multinational firms to come in. There's a variety of ways that globalization could do this. But it's going to improve the well-being of individuals, particularly those who are consumers of goods produced in the impacted sector. But any change in relative prices produces pecuniary externalities, and technical change may be beneficial in aggregate, but harmful for specific individuals. So this insight is the same. That's what the general equilibrium model is designed for. It's to analyze a bunch of individuals. They have different endowments. They're engaged in different activities. You impose a shock understand what the effects, what the impacts are. And that's been basically my whole career. It's been doing this. Because I came back from this thing, and I told my advisor, I told Alan, I'm all in. I want to get a job in the econ department. He says, whoa. He says, slow down. You'll never get a job in the econ department. You have a degree in engineering. Forget it. And so I said, no, I want to do that. And he says, well, you can take a postdoc here. And then I took a postdoc for a year, and then I got a job in Canada for 1 year. The postdoc wouldn't let me teach economics, but I took a job for 1 year at Western Ontario. And then they renewed it for a second year, and a third year, and a fourth year, and a fifth year. So I was on 1 year contracts for 5 years, and I had 2 kids, new kids, and I had to have a plan B. So my game plan was I'm going to consult as much as I can in the summers, because if I get fired here, I want to be able to get a job. So that was my game plan. As a consequence, I did more consulting than just about anybody I know. And I discovered that doing consulting jobs was kind of fun because you could actually write up papers about it. So my rule was I go for whoever pays me most as long as it's a project I think is worthwhile. And I only do projects where I can write a paper. And I always work with people I enjoy. So that's the basic rules, right? And that's been my rule all the way through. I just basically do this. As a consequence, I got to Wisconsin. Boy, this faculty is amazing. You have so many Brahmins here. Everybody works on NSF grants. So everybody here is like, never has to do this. I've done more sort of low-end consulting projects than anybody I know around here. But anyway, so that's how I got into this game. But by the way, the bridge now, there's a jeep trail that goes up the right bank. But on the left bank, there's no bridge, or there's no road. So there's now 25 mules living at the bridge, and they go back and forth every day carrying stuff. So the trail gets used more than it's ever been used, and it's also now 75% of the tourists do the Annapurna circuit, and that's on that bridge. So it's kind of cool. Optimization. So one of the cool things when I worked on my thesis, I worked on this paper here, a master's thesis under the direction of Stephen Robinson in industrial engineering, Norman Josephy. That was the Bible. Everybody went to work on that, and that was basically an unpublished master's thesis from University of Wisconsin that basically pioneered all the methods, the complementarity methods are used around the world were from that thesis written here across the street. And people in the know knew this was the thing, and so I worked with Lars Mathieson in Bergen on computational methods. In parallel to our work, Michael Ferris was working on his thesis at Cambridge, and I got to know Michael. I went to hear him talk at a conference and started throwing tomatoes from the back of the room. He was saying he had the fastest algorithm in the world, and I said, no, I can solve that problem 3 times faster than you can, right? And so he and I had this sort of fun camaraderie, but then because I was moving into economics, I quickly realized this guy, A, was ultra smart, B, was great to work with, and also was really open. He really wants to work on real problems. So he and I started off a career where we basically, both of us, he would work on algorithms and I worked on applications. And I gave up my solver to work with his solver, and we did a lot of stuff together. It's really been productive. Along the way, so as a master's, in my PhD, I worked on a 12,000 line Fortran code that's still in use. It's kind of fun, it's still around. So this modeling language that we use a lot. But Michael has all sorts of new tools that are developed here, extended mathematical programs that have all sorts of powerful, cool applications. So there's a whole lot of exciting stuff going on. We have the Wisconsin National Data Consortium here that's basically run an attempt to do an open source tools for understanding the impacts at the state and local level of trade agreements is our main sort of idea. And we have a number of different groups, including EPA and Commerce and a number of other groups involved. 5 minutes, okay. So Brexit. So as I said, I was going to begin with a picture of Ben. I wanted a picture of Ben. So Brexit was this project proposal. For 40 years, the UK didn't do any trade policy analysis. All that was outsourced to the Germans through the EU. So they didn't analyze anything. So suddenly, we're going to have Brexit, and they have no method for analyzing any of the outcomes. Right? And so they put up a sign saying, we want to find someone to help us analyze this, and they get all the consulting firms. And my German former student and I, who often collaborate with Christoph, we write a proposal, and lo and behold, we're in the finals with McKinsey and Price Waterhouse and all this stuff. And so I thought, this is kind of crazy. But lo and behold, they decide to pick us Chris and I, it's just the two of us. We do projects where I never have employees. We do everything together. We never do anything through resources of the university. We only do work in the summer, and we basically just always split stuff 50-50. So he and I just do projects, and we never do things without being published. Brexit, they said, you can publish it in 25 years. So the project began, and at the very first meeting, I discovered what the real plan was. This is the only picture of Ben. Andy didn't have a picture. I was so mad at Andy. So Andy Stuckey and Ben Whitworth were the two guys, two recent master's degree students from not Oxbridge, from Exeter and from another red brick university, who had just graduated like 6 months before. And so their plan was they're going to assign these two master's students to analyze the consequences of Brexit, and they'll go off for 10 years, and then they'll come back. So the idea was, this is a hot potato, I want to touch it, let's move it off to the side. They didn't know how motivated these guys were, because these guys caught on the fact that this is their careers, and really it was. And they worked so hard. They were fantastic to work with. They were just great. And so we basically have all these crazy analysis of Brexit by all the Leave guys. I could go into details, but it's just nuts. And so we look at what the effects are of the range of impacts. We go out and we get the project in December. In January, we have the first set of results. And so that was very encouraging. And I went there thinking, they said, well, though a few people interested in the model will come. I go to the room and there's 65 people there. So basically there's a huge interest within the Treasury about what the impacts were, and they had no framework for understanding what the consequences were. So we built this first model right off the bat. A lot of this relied on work that Praveen's familiar with from Purdue on GTAP, the Global Trade and Analysis Project. Built the standard sort of off-the-shelf model, queued up the thing. We were able to replicate all the results from the various groups that had claimed Brexit would be good or bad. We were able to understand exactly where all the bodies were buried, what happened. And then a year later, we came up with 3 different extensions of that, sort of more state-of-the-art. Again, originally I was going to talk a lot about Mellitz and Krugman and so forth. I decided I'm not going to, eyes glaze over so fast. So there's lots of models. They have different theories about factors that drive productivity. And so you want to build those. The key thing is you don't want to know the answer, you just want to know what does that assumption give you. And so we quickly got that set up, and then this then surfaced as a leaked set of slides about 3 months later. Now, a number of the analysis was not all ours, the estimate of the non-tariff barriers. I should say the British civil service are fantastic. They're incredibly hardworking. This was a really great group of people to work with. And so the analysis was really tight and really done, and it was leaked at the perfect time. And this, at least, I don't know, I think we stopped Brexit. Because the analysis showed the number that came out of this, 9.5% GDP cost on average, expected, possibly 15%. All those numbers were right from this analysis. And so basically, even though, and in Britain, they don't usually hire academics. Academics are on 12-month salaries, unlike in the US, where we're on 9-month salaries. So they usually don't hire academics. They feel the academics should give them stuff for free. So our analysis was not something that was, they weren't going to hold us for very long, but we worked for a year on it, and I thought it went really well. And as a consequence, I'd say most of the results contributed to the perception that Brexit, I would say, is true. Almost any model I've seen that's sort of coherent and calibrated shows that Brexit is like ultra stupid for the UK. It's ultra stupid. I mean, you have to have a really strong desire to not have foreigners living in London. Right, so it's really crazy. So anyway, that was my involvement there. And I'll just conclude by just pointing to a paper from 1984 that I really like, the energy modeling model. My favorite models as claims to authority explores the problem of models as knowledge versus models as symbols, and examines the model that conflicts between them produce. So the key thing to be aware of is, the crucial thing is to be familiar with what the various modeling assumptions are and to be able to synthesize what's going across. So that's a rapid-fire introduction to what models are about and how this actually works. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. And thanks, Laura, the WARF, the Discovery Institute. Thank you for hosting this event. I hadn't actually paid attention to the title of the topic until last week. And then I saw the title, Disruptive Trade Policy. And then I thought to myself, what is disruptive to a group of free traders might be what we call, or policy practitioners would call, corrective trade policy. So it was interesting when I actually saw the title. But be that as it may, my charge this evening is to give you a sense of the type of analytics that goes into the trade policy formulation process, trade agreements and beyond. And that's what I'll try to do through several lessons that I, as an economist, have learned at the U.S. Department of Commerce. But before I do that, let me do a little bit of a stage setting so that you understand where we come from. Let's go back to November 9th, 2016. 3:30 a.m., I wake up, turn on the radio, and to my utter surprise, find that the President-elect of the United States is an individual who has trashed every trade agreement I have worked on for the last 20 years, and that there was a group of senior advisors who had a very low opinion of us mainstream economists. The only saving grace at that time in the morning was the fact that my wife, too, thinks very lowly of economists, and I felt completely at home at that time. At 9:30, I'm sitting in my office. I get a call from my lovely daughter who lives in Madison but commutes to the Eastern District Court of Milwaukee. And he said, "Dad, I feel terrible. I shouldn't have come into work." Well, that made it 2 of 3 in the family. At 3:30 that afternoon, a senior staffer comes in and says, "Praveen, we have a lot of young economists. A lot of young economists are actually sobbing, and they're afraid about whether economists are needed anymore. Can you please go and talk with them?" I did. And then at 6 o'clock, around 6 o'clock, I'm leaving the building, and I lose my steadiness. I have to hold on to the railing. And then I come to find out that I have a burgeoning aneurysm in my brain, and I had to go to New York for a surgery. So that was my state of play some 1,050 days ago. And yet, I can stand in front of you today and say that my role as an economist has never been as important, nor has ever been as used as it has in this last 150 weeks. So what then I want to talk about now is what got me to that situation, and I will do this through a bunch of lessons that I have learned as an economist working in the government. To draw on the lessons, what I'll do is focus really on 3 trade events. The first is the Trans-Pacific Partnership that the Obama administration had signed, and that was negated or trashed by the current administration. The second one is an initiative of this administration, which is what we call the Section 232 investigation, or Section 232 tariffs under the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, which allows the president to impose tariff based on national security considerations. And national security can have a lot of broad definitions, both including military needs and the health of a given sector. And lastly, I also want to then draw upon USMCA or NAFTA 2.0. Now, the reason I draw on these 3 examples are, in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, what we were focusing on during the Obama administration was our offensive interests, right? How do we go and open markets in other countries? That was our focus. Although in the Section 232 investigations, as I keep talking about, steel and anything, and a few other products, our focus was defensive interests. How do we ensure that certain industries in the US are maintained, are kept healthy because of national security considerations? And then NAFTA 2.0 or USMCA is a combination of where we had offensive interests, but then the Trump administration added some additional defensive interests in terms of how do we strengthen the North American motor vehicle industry. Okay, so that's the framework that I'm talking about. And the other thing I want you to remember, and if you saw me check emails, it's just because of the pace at which I have to work. Typically, when I get a request from the White House or the secretary, I have just a few hours, or if I'm lucky, I'll get a couple of days. I remember one evening when the secretary was on the phone, and he called up and said, I don't like your assumption that you have used, which is full employment in the steel industry. And I said, Mr. Secretary, I can see reasons why that can be faulty, because there is residual unemployment. People in the steel industry have not been able to find jobs when they lost their jobs. And then he said, when can you get it done? And I said, how about between noon and 2 tomorrow? His response was, it was 10 or 5 that evening. His response was, I have a meeting with the president at 6 o'clock, and you're going to give me this analysis tomorrow. What use is your analysis? So that's the sort of space that I have to work on. And so by definition, I have to be flexible, and I have to have a lot of approximations, And the problem is, once the results go out, you could either be famous or you could be infamous, right? I mean, it just, there is a lot of, there's a lot riding in the analysis that I provide if it is made public. Okay, so so having said that, now let me actually get to the lessons, and this will sort of give you a feel for the type of analysis we do. I'm going to talk about 5 lessons if I have time. The first one essentially is stick to your strengths, and I'll get into this. The second one is understand your policy. The third one is know your market and institutions. The fourth one, consider distributional implications. And lastly, communicate a vibrant story. So those are the 5 themes I really want to talk about, time permitting. Now, as I mentioned, the reason my unit and we have been so productive is principally because of the use of computable general equilibrium model that Tom described in the policy formulation process. So lesson number 1, as I said, is stick to your strengths. Now, what happens is, whether it's in academia or it's in government, once we build an analytical tool, our general focus is, can you squeeze any policy we want through that tool, right? Have model, will travel. That is our general framework. But then, when you actually talk about trade negotiations or the trade policy formulation process, there are 4 stages that we talk about. The first stage is the preparatory stage, where you're looking for broad analysis, broad gains to certain sectors, to certain countries. That's what you're looking at. The second stage is the actual negotiations. In the actual negotiations, what we look for is very subsectoral details. We need to know the actual policies. We need to really understand the markets. And that requires a different set of tools. The third stage is the ratification stage, and that's where we are in the new NAFTA agreement. And ratification is when we have to go to Congress and sell this agreement. And for that, we need a different set of tools, because the interest of the constituencies and Congress and industry is very different than when we start the negotiation. And the fourth stage is the assessment phase. And we as economists run away from that because we really don't want to go through our own trash. And we let trade lawyers do a lot of that work, right? I mean, because our tendency is, there's a new agreement coming on, we move from one agreement to the other agreement, we really don't get a chance to revisit what we analyze. And in some respects, what this administration has done is really made us revisit some of the assumptions and the things that we did with past trade agreements, whether it was with TPP NAFTA 1.0, or the US, Japan, US, Korea, any of these agreements. So the strengths of a CGE model typically is you provide broad results. How is the overall economy going to improve? How are overall employment rate going to change? And so to that extent, CGE models are best used in the preparatory stage. We try to stick our analysis on computable general equilibrium model in the preparatory stage. And partly we also use it in the ratification stage, but we need to have it modified to get into that stage. So sometimes when we try to use the same framework in every stage of the negotiations, we run really into a big problem, and that's what we really have to be careful of. And that's one of the lessons that we have learned. The second thing the second lesson that we have learned is that you need to know your policy well. If there is one area where the policymaker has a comparative advantage over us economists, it's in the policy. They know it. The problem is we get into problems because we do not adequately represent in models the type of policies that really exist. And this really comes in three forms, right? One, it's the inadequacy of policy representation. Most models, the computable general equilibrium models and other models also, they represent tariffs, they represent policy through tariffs. Well, the fact of the matter is, tariffs is a really small portion of the distortion that exists in markets. You have procurement policies, you have custom facilitation, you have any number of other distortions that exist that never gets modeled. And so when you only use a framework in which you remove tariffs, you really are then underestimating the gains from liberalization or the cost of tariff imposition. And even within tariffs, there is a problem, right? Let me hold that thought for one. Then let me get to the second issue. When people work on tariffs, we all agree that tariffs should be removed. That's the easy part, right? The difficult part is how you get there. I mean, it's like we all agree we want to get to heaven, but not quite yet, right? I mean, so the issue is how do you get to heaven? And that's exactly, in tariff staging, that is exactly the same problem, right? And so, but for tariff staging, you need a model that is not endpoint to endpoint. And that's the typical model we use. We need models that actually can show you the path in which these changes can be made. And so the other thing, the other lesson that I keep saying we have come up with is, be careful just using one little framework of giving endpoint analysis, because we all agree on the endpoint. Heaven is great. It's just that we don't want to get there, as I said, right? Yet. The other problem that we have, and in terms of policy representation, is really not being able to adequately model non-market economies. And what do I mean by this? Thank you. This is, in some respects, the China problem, right? They operate in a non-market framework, and our problem is we do not capture those policies. So anytime we use our models to study China, we're completely out of whack in terms of reality. Now, actually, to talk about the China problem, I would suggest that for somebody, I invite my boss, Nazak, who is really a China hand, and you probably would really enjoy her conversation if she ever were to come here. But again, addressing the China problem, because in China we have intellectual property right theft, we have cyber intrusion, we have forced technology transfer. None of these are actually being captured in the framework that we work. And this is part of the reason why the Trump administration introduced the so-called 301 tariffs, right? I mean, this is to see whether we can change some of this behavior, and we never do that. I've got 5 minutes, so let me just quickly go through the other three lessons. Another problem we have, as I said, is know your markets well. right? In many, very often our frameworks are too aggregated. So we talk about the motor vehicle industry. Well, the motor vehicle industry has the vehicle manufacturers, it has the auto parts producers, and it has service and dealers. What policies come into play? The impact of policies on these three groups can be competing, right? I mean, a good policy for motor vehicle producers might be bad for the auto parts producers. And that's why what we run into problems is the aggregation. The second thing we run into problems is, and Tom is helping us with this, is very often these days, policies now include requirements in terms of specific companies. This is one of the outcomes of the well, it was there before, but essentially, if you're producing automobiles in the US, in the North American market, 75% of that vehicle has to be sourced within North America. That was one of the things I was unable to really get done properly, just because that is much more an individual company issue, and trying to get it into a broad aggregate framework creates a whole lot of problems. I have 2 more minutes. The other lesson, I think, is distributional implications, right? We as economists sort of tend to dismiss distribution and say winners get compensate losers. And yet, if you look at the last elections, what are happening was we really did not account for the distributional implications of many of these policies. The distribution policies was in terms of not looking at how skilled labor versus unskilled labor were affected, not looking at how various regions of the countries were affected. And so when you just give it up to chance and say the US gains, or when you say everybody, we don't take into account occupational classes, then that creates a problem. And that's one of the projects actually I'm working with Tom on. Then finally, let me conclude by saying, why was my analysis so accepted with this administration? Principally because, as I talked about, there are both offensive interests and defensive interests. In this particular case, the general equilibrium model that I refer to, when we used it for defensive cases, for the steel industry, for instance, what we could show are essentially gains to that given industry for which we're trying to support. But in the framework, a lot of the cost, the downstream costs of these policies were spread out, right? And so if you're instituting a set of policies to help a certain sector, then then in many instances, the defensive posturing makes modeling results a lot more acceptable. We ran into a problem with the TPP when we used computable general equilibrium model, because the gains were 0.35% of GDP or 50 billion, and in a $17 trillion economy, it's not very big. So it's very difficult to really be able to sell it and say, hey, there are huge gains. But when we are looking at the defensive concerns, it is a lot easier to deal with it. I think I have my time is up, so thank you. There were other lessons, but we can certainly talk about it later.
Yeah, I was going to go back to your slide presentation. One of the slides you showed, I think, the winner of the economics prize, Nobel Prize in '75, making a comment about the 60s and 70s were a time of experimentation that, appeared to have been largely had run its course by that point. I guess my question is this. Were some of those theories around what I remember, the concept that we had overcome scarcity and we were on the edge of abundance, and that we had this new future where the issue would be how to dispose of the goods that were produced? I remember that type of thinking. Is that sort of what was being implied in the slide that you showed?
That would not be my interpretation. I guess the thing is there's been various groups on both sides of that equation. You think about the Club of Rome, or you think about the, I did a project on the circular economy for the Ellen MacArthur Foundation a few years ago. had to do with recycling and so forth. So there are groups that have strong feelings on both sides about scarcity and innovation. I typically, for undergraduate students that are interested in this, I usually point them to The End of Oil is a book that's by Paul Roberts that's pretty good. And there's another book. So there's a variety of different points of view. I like coming from Alan Mann's tradition. It's more being systematic and trying to look at what the scope is for substitution and the idea that there may be scarcity and that should, to the extent that that gets reflected in prices, people can innovate. But these climate change makes a number of these things much more challenging because if you have systematic problems with productivity, what the effect is of climate change on food scarcity is something that a lot of us who work in that area are concerned about. So, you know.
So my question sort of reflects a political leaning here. It's my perception that your challenge is to build a model to answer what they know to be the conclusion they want. I'd like you to comment as to the extent that that might be true, or in fact, do you really feel like you have the ability to take the analysis where the analysis goes?
That's not true. In fact, I don't use a model that is not publicly available. When I do my analysis, Tom Hurtle from Purdue called me up one day and said, "Hey, why are you using my model to do some sort of a protection analysis?" I said, "Tom, you can replicate it, right? Because everything I do has to be replicable. And the tools I use are generally publicly available, either through a consortium. It's just my job is to do the analysis, and I provide the good parts. I provide the bad parts. If there are tariffs, I will tell them these are the unintended consequences. These are the intended consequences. At the end of the day, then it's for the Secretary or the White House to decide which of these they want to accept or not. But my job is to provide a complete analysis.
I'd say I have a story that goes with this. The first time I got the job in Canada, I'm like this engineer. I show up, and John Wally is one of the practitioner, the original inventors of general equilibrium theory. He and I decided to write a paper together. We sit down to write paper, and my deepest fears were confirmed. He says, "Okay, what are we going to put in the paper? Let me show you the figures that are going to go in the paper." And he gets out a pencil and he draws the figures and he says, "This is the way this will go, and this way." And I thought, God, I always suspected that he gets exactly, he basically makes everything up before he goes, right? But in fact, I learned that actually what he did was really smart. He takes the figures and he puts them in a manila envelope, puts them in his drawer, and then he goes out and builds the model to replicate the story that he's just told. It's a story, right? You're telling a story. You build a model to tell the story, and then you ask, does that story hold water? Because you pull the numbers that come off the computer and you compare the numbers in your figure, you think, oh my God, the magnitude of that is much smaller than we expected. There are lots of examples that, like zombie economics, there's lots of stories around. My favorite one was a term that I invented in a paper in 1993 called carbon leakage. It's the consequence that if you have carbon constraints in the US, then suddenly all the steel production migrates to India. The Indians produce steel less efficiently to us. They'll produce all the steel there. They're less efficient than us. Overall global emissions will go up, not down. That's the standard story. Build a model. Show me that in a model. You build a model with any trade elasticities that are coherent and estimated. Maximum leakage rate you ever get is 20%. It means you get, for every 100 tons of carbon you reduce in the US, you get 80 tons reduction. Some of it is frittered away through trade effects, but the competitiveness doesn't drive that. So I'm all into make up a story, tell me the story, but then can you calibrate that story and generate results and show it in a way where you're completely open about what your assumptions are to make it compelling. If you can make a compelling case, then okay, your argument has substantiation, but somebody else can have another argument and come up, and you may end up with two arguments, so you can't resolve them, so the model may not resolve it, but the fact that you go at it with a particular agenda, I have no problem with that. That's fine. Bring it on. My attitude is bring it on. I'll look at what you've done, we'll assess whether it makes sense, fine.
I'm going to ask a nuance of the last question, and if it's redundant, just move on. But the comment was endpoint. We all agree it's great to get to heaven, or however you define heaven. And you want to optimize that. So what if there's big confusion on the endpoint? So the question would be, you brought up coal and you brought up climate change. Well, those can be two very different things. So you can save an industry, but but you're also going to cause harm over here. How are you seeing the endpoints determined, and how are those determined in this administration and in this world we live in today with really split worldviews?
Well, I don't know about climate, but in trade negotiations, we know the endpoint because the endpoint is what we determined, right? So for instance, we determined that in 15 years from now, we will remove all tariffs, right? Or in 20 years from now, we will make sure none of the non-tariff barriers are there. So we actually determine the endpoint. And so the issue I'm talking about is, how do we get there? I mean, it's a policy process. And now, is there uncertainty? Yes, there is uncertainty, and none of us are. But none of the people who negotiated the agreement are probably going to be at the end point anyhow. So it's that uncertainty that creates this urgency of trying to do something up front. But on climate change,
I guess I could speak on and this is always a challenge about what is the social welfare function? How do we trade off? When some people gain and other people lose, how do you design policies to make it a Pareto improvements for everyone to get better off? In climate, the question is, how do we trade off well-being of current generations versus future generations? How do we think about impoverished people in Africa today versus what happens? So that's a very good question. This is something that's the choice of the social welfare function and what society should choose. That's not really the purview of the economist. The economist to say, let's build a model. Tell me what the policy is. I'll tell you what the range of impacts are, but I can't really judge whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. You have to leave that to the policymakers to assess.
We have time for 2 more questions. I also had a version of that question. So when you think about building that inclusive economy that lifts everybody up, are there models that exist that bear out, these inputs get to this output? Or are there theories that maybe you haven't tested out in a model that you might have in terms of what it would take to build an economy that's inclusive for more people?
So I spent a year in Australia with the kids because I wanted them to sort of learn how to body surf in big waves. So we had a fun year, and that year got paid for by working on Russian accession to the WTO. So we worked on the project looking at pricing of gas and what the effects were. And so we went to Gazkomstat to get the household data to do the analysis. We knew the Russians were maniacs about collecting data, so we knew they had like a data set that had. For me, this was a big data set. These days, this is a tiny data set, but it's 55,000 households. And so they gave us the data set and they said, you can use the data under the one caveat is in your model, every household has to be in the model. They wanted to know the impact on every single household across. And so that was the thing we started with, was the first thing to do, come up with was an approximation method for doing that, and then acknowledging that if you happen to get a data set from someone, a household, they fill out the form and they happen to have bought an airplane ticket last week, all they care about is airplane tickets. If airplane tickets get more expensive, that household's going to lose, right? There's no way around it. And so the thing is, in our framework, you're always going to be faced with this thing about how precisely do you gradate things, and how do you acknowledge it? In the analysis, we came up, it's a figure I was going to put in the talk, I didn't, that shows the impacts, and we show across model types what happens to the distribution of impacts across households. And I think it's nice to try to quantify what the range of impacts are across how much heterogeneity we have. But the idea that you're going to search for something everyone's better off, I think it's pretty hard to do.
And that's where the concept of compensation comes in, right?
So we're less than 45 days from a no-deal Brexit. What do your models say? I think you alluded to numbers before, but what does your model say about the UK in terms of GDP, inflation, unemployment when we have a hard exit?
So there are different representations of hard exit, and the part of the challenge is understanding what the transitory costs are versus the steady state costs. I think a hard exit eventually, the steady state costs would be high. I mean, in our model, we come up with a number like 12, 15% GDP, which is a big cost. And that's part of it is if you do a Google search for cartogram economic GDP in UK provinces. And the UK is basically just London, right? London's huge. And there's a huge amount of London GDP, which is in finance markets, which that stuff all, if that industry leaves, there's a huge impact. So 12% may be a small number. The problem is the transitory impacts are potentially huge. And I'm just another layperson reading this stuff. I've never tried to model what happens when they suddenly decide to shut this stuff down. And even if you fly into Heathrow when the guys who are at the customs booth are working to rule, that's one of my favorite terms. They decide they're going to have a labor action by being slow about letting people through. It can take you like 6 hours to get through there. And you imagine what happens if they suddenly decide to blow away the existing thing. I don't know what's going to happen. It's really, the thing is that there's lots of stuff about this that I find very mysterious and I don't really understand. And lately I've been teaching, I teach this class, Globalization, Poverty, and Development for undergrads, and they're asking me, what do I make of the world? It's like, man, I don't know what's going on. It's like, so lately I've become a big fan of social psychologists. So if you want to look at a nice TED Talk, there's a great TED Talk by Jonathan Haidt, H-A-I-D-T, from 2007. It's about factors that drive people's thinking. And suddenly, I have a sister who's an anthropologist. Suddenly, I'm like outside the box. I'm off the reservation in terms of economics. It's like there's all this other stuff that explains what's going on. Economics really doesn't explain this stuff very well, I'm afraid.
So with that, please join me in thanking our speakers. And I think Tom and Praveen have agreed to stick around. If you want to come up and talk a little bit more, they'll stick around for a few more minutes. And we hope to see you back here for the Science Festival and in October, where we'll hear from some experts on how we handle adapting to climate change. Thanks so much.